Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On July 25th, Tunisian President Kais Saied fired the Prime Minister, dismissed Parliament, and assumed dictatorial powers. This was a self-coup in which the president invoked an emergency clause in the constitution, allowing him to rule by decree. The move came as a shock to outsiders. Tunisia was long considered the lone success story of the Arab Spring. It was where the Arab Spring began in 2011, and it was the only country to emerge from the upheaval as a functioning democracy. The Tunisian civil society groups that helped peacefully broker a political consensus around the country's democratic transition even won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. But as my guest today, Tarek Megirisi, explains, Tunisians, by and large, have grown increasingly wary of this political system. It has not delivered for them, and it is in this context that Kais Saied, who was a relative newcomer to Tunisian politics, was able to seize power. Tarek Megirisi is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and we kick off this conversation with a discussion of Kais Saied's unique background before having a longer discussion about the domestic and international implications of this power grab in Tunisia. This is a timely episode. Let me know what you think. Hit me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg or send me an email using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. And if you are a regular listener to the show, please share it with friends and colleagues. Word of mouth is the best way to grow the audience and make this an even more sustainable enterprise. Thank you. All right, now here is my conversation with Tarek Megirisi of the European Council on Foreign Relations.
Kais Saied is a constitutional law professor. He's not a politician by experience or by training. And he kind of came out of nowhere in the presidential elections in 2019. His campaign started slowly and quietly. He was kind of this outsider who spoke a lot about how the system needed to be changed. You know, he was quite a populist character. And it seemed to get quite a lot of traction quite quickly. In the first round of voting, I think he surprised everybody by just what percentage of the vote he got. And then he ran away with it in the second round of voting, and he won by a landslide. I mean, by some kind of measure, President Saied received more votes to become president than the entire Tunisian parliament got for each of their MPs. So it's quite a significant show of support for the message that he was giving, which was this kind of nationalist, quite traditionalist, economically left-wing idea that Tunisia's political system had been corrupt and essentially needed to change. And then what came after was a surprise to some and not to others, in the sense that he spent the next 2 years believing that his huge landslide victory had given him a popular mandate to reach outside the traditional bounds of the presidency, which is a largely ceremonial position in Tunisia's system, to try to exert some control over policy and with the hope of making constitutional changes. But in doing so, some would say and argue that Saied almost became a part of the class which he loathed so much. You know, for the last 2 years, even at times of extreme crisis for the state, like in trying to deal with the COVID-19 response, he has been an obstructionist, and he has stopped policy from moving forward. He has stopped changes from being made, all as part of a political gambit for him to get his own way. So he's kind of a mixed bag and has come along quite some way from being this, extremely well-spoken almost poetic constitutional law professor who appeared on the scene in 2019.
Yeah, it's funny. The descriptions I hear of his speech and his diction are fascinating. Apparently, he speaks with like a very almost like odd diction, but is also kind of like styles himself as a man of the people, which is interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't need to be something which sets him apart as maybe a member of the bourgeoisie, but it's something that shows that he has some refinement, if you know what I mean. He
Yeah.
speaks classical Arabic very well. He writes as well. His calligraphy is incredible, and he writes these very nice looking letters sometimes. But at the same time, he's been a professor in a local university his whole life. He stays in the same kind of lower middle class neighborhood his whole life, and so that's where he gets this man of the people vibe from, even if he doesn't really have the traditional populist personality.
So what triggered this extraordinary decision move on July 25th, in which he has sought to exert extra constitutional powers?
Well, as I said before, this is something that he has attempted in various guises over the past couple of years. And we've seen this one coming for a while, even if, as always, it's a shock when it finally happens and when it works out so well. There's been a conversation during the rounds for the last couple of months of whether President Saied should trigger Article 80 as a way to kind of undercut the chaos of the moment, whereby the present government was seen to be failing Tunisians on the economy and on COVID-19. And this was something that his supporters were discussing. And we saw leaked in the Middle East Eye a couple of months ago, the exact plan almost, which he used last Sunday.
And just to be clear, Article 80 is the provision in the Tunisia constitution that enables the president to invoke emergency powers.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something which is kind of designed as, these typical emergency clauses within a constitution, designed for some unforeseen scenario. But, for a constitutional law professor, he's taken a very abnormal reading of the Constitution, because he really should have discussed this first with the Prime Minister and the Speaker of Parliament. And the Parliament is supposed to remain in session permanently whilst this clause is active. And so some would argue that, President Saied has actually declared a state of emergency, and the imminent threat he's responding to is the parliament itself. And that seems to be their description of why it's still constitutionally valid. But these kind of strange readings of the Constitution, which, when he's questioned about them, he'll just respond with the notion that he's a constitutional law professor, is not something new once more. This is how he has been trying to exert control over the state throughout the last 2 years. Because as a president in Tunisia, he hasn't really got very many tools at his disposal. But given that the Tunisian system never really appointed a constitutional court, he is actually the last arbiter, so to speak, the guy who gives the final ruling on any reading of the Constitution. And so he is really exploiting that to his advantage here.
And that's an important point to emphasize, that the Tunisia just doesn't have a constitutional court. It was supposed to be set up, but it has not been set up. And so you're saying that now the president is just assuming those authorities himself. What authorities has he given himself over the last few weeks?
He's given himself all the power, essentially. By dissolving parliament first, then he realized that he can't just dissolve parliament, and he can only freeze them. And by firing the prime minister, and by extension his government, he kind of assumed all executive and legislative powers in his hands. Even if it's not permanent legislation which he can create, he will rule by decree effectively. And then on top of that, he named himself the chief prosecutor. Again, this was something that was pushed back on by the judiciary in Tunisia. But it gave a pretty clear signal that for the time being, for at least the next month, President Said is going to be the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches of the Tunisian government.
I mean, it's just sort of extraordinary when you think about it. Someone who has very little political experience got himself elected into what you describe as a largely ceremonial position, used that position to assume full control of all levers of government.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. And President Said has always been a bit of a clumsy guy when it comes to his political scheming. And he's usually been outmaneuvered by the more experienced politicians within the system. So it's something of a surprise that this time it actually worked. And this was largely down to the army. Because after he made his announcement, the response of the prime minister and the parliament was the typical response to President Said. Let's just ignore him and carry on about our business. And that's that. But when the parliament tried to attend an emergency session, the military blocked them. Similarly, in the early days or in that first night, when the prime minister sought to try to plan a cabinet meeting, the palaces of government were blocked by the military. And so the military essentially made sure that everybody had to listen to President Said this time around. And this is something, again, which was provided extra impetus or extra weight by the popular response that his announcement got him. And this kind of idea of ruling by a popular mandate is always something that's driven President Said and given him that sense of purpose to do things which others would merely view as destructive or obstructionist.
Because the popular response to this coup was largely, receptive. There haven't been like mass protests. People are generally accepting of it.
Yeah, I mean, there were celebrations at first, and it's kind of weird, right? Because if you see all of the vox pops and the people who are speaking or interviewing those on the street, you get kind of a clear indication that this is not so much a show of support for President Said. It's a show of support or a sign of relief that finally the population have gotten won over their political class, who they view as wholly responsible for the mess that they find themselves in. And so this has been, a tremendous boon to President Said. Now, it's not to say that he has the full support of the country. I think that there are still quite a few groups scattered across the country who are either professionals such as legal associations or are just supporters of various political parties who don't agree with him. And many who celebrated the decision but are kind of wary about where this all might lead. But for now, those political parties have told their supporters to not go into the streets. They don't really want to challenge this because I think it's pretty clear that Said has made a clear decision. He seems to have popular support for it. So perhaps there's a political calculation at the back of their minds which goes along the lines of, well, if we give this guy enough rope, he's just going to hang himself eventually. So let's not challenge the street.
So, Tunisia was the sole democracy to emerge from the Arab Spring. The civil society groups that helped broker the compromise that led to the, at one point, a flourishing democratic moment in Tunisia. They won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015. Here we are 6 years later. How did we get to this point?
Well, I mean, in a sense, we kind of got to this point because ever since the world kind of applauded the constitution and the spirit of cooperation that came from that consensus politics, everyone has just ignored Tunisia. And whilst everybody's attention was turned elsewhere, Tunisia's political elite kind of settled down into a new status quo. And this is something we've actually seen elsewhere in the region, even in places where the kind of political revolutions weren't as successful as Tunisia, whereby you can get rid of a dictator and you can even have elections and parliaments and so on, but it becomes a lot harder to get rid of the dictator system. And new politicians and new elites just get corrupted into the same ways of working. And this is essentially what happened in Tunisia. I mean, the various political parties were all caught up in what's almost kind of a petty soap opera, where they are always scheming and fighting with one another for a bit more control and a bit more power, and never really dealing with the problems of the state. And these are severe problems. And so even the plans of the constitution were not carried out. You know, we've talked about the constitutional court, which was never formed. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, really. There were also all these commissions which were supposed to be formed that would help the judiciary and the state kind of address key issues. These were ignored. A lot of the key laws were never updated for fear of antagonizing the Interior Ministry. The penal code was never revisited. So Tunisians feel like they were supposed to have done a revolution to reclaim social justice and to reclaim more control over their economy. And yet they got a new political system, but their relationship with their Interior Ministry stayed much the same. And their economy and their economic prospects got worse, if anything. So they felt like there was a lot of unfinished business there.
In the days since the coup, I don't know, I'm calling it a coup. It seems to be like a coup. Maybe it's a self-coup. It kind of, seems to me like a coup. I don't know. Is that the term of art you would use to describe it?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at exactly what happened, it seems to be a pretty textbook example of what they would call a self-coup or an auto-golpe, which is, a legally elected leader just simply uses or exploits the system that he's in to gather all powers in his hands. I mean, that's a pretty accurate description of what happened, but there is a lot of pushback against this word coup because there are a lot of connotations which come with it, and it's seen as denigrating the opportunity which people believe that Kais Saied has given them, either correctly or naively.
Fair enough. So what has been the international reaction since the events of July 25th, both regionally and from the United States and key players in Europe?
I mean, from the Western world, it's been kind of muted. I mean, you would have expected the strongest response to have come from the Europeans on this, given the European relationship with Tunisia, Europe's role in kind of trying to help the democratization along. But it's been kind of a let's wait and see where this goes approach. Some very neutral statements were released, essentially saying that President Saied should ensure to respect the system while staying on the sidelines. The strongest response has come from the United States, actually, or at least it's the most public response, whereby the Secretary of State Blinken has published the readouts of his calls with President Saied and has said quite clearly that he expects President Saied to not cross certain red lines that would end Tunisia's designation as a democracy. And I think that's the strongest message he's received yet, to tell him to not cross that Rubicon. The regional picture has been a bit more contested. So we have Tunisia's immediate neighbors, or the big powers in its neighborhood, which are Algeria and Morocco, two countries who are in a constant kind of pantomime competition with each other. And Algeria has kind of taken up this big brother-esque role over Tunisia in recent years, and is now trying to step in to mediate this and to ensure that things stay stable, so to speak. But at the same time, there is a group of states in the broader Middle East and North Africa region, and let's call them the counter revolutionaries, so to speak. Those whose policy for the last 10 years has been to push back the Arab Spring, and these are namely the Arab Gulf monarchies and Egypt, and they've been extremely receptive to what President Saied has done. They have, used their media channels to cheer him on and to declare this as a great success against the Muslim Brotherhood. There were even some kind of cryptic messages of support the day of Said's coup announcement, saying, a big blow is coming to our enemies, or to our Islamist enemies in the Muslim Brotherhood. And it seems that the next step is going to be there to to give some political support and some diplomatic support to President Saied should he need it, and just to let him know that they are there to defend him and that he should feel free to take this where he wishes to take this. And this might cause some friction, especially if Egypt and Algeria, although there was a statement that was released saying that they are both in sync here and they both support President Saied. What's going to happen if they start clashing with one another over who gets to be President Said's best friend and the kind of country which manages this all?
And maybe it's worth pointing out that part of the kind of political context in which these other countries in the region are intervening, is that the largest political party, I believe, is a moderate Islamist party, Ennahda. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, Ennahda.
Ennahda, yes. I've done several episodes on Tunisia, and I've just never gotten the name of that political party correctly pronounced.
It's the H in the middle.
Yeah. So it was in this context, for example, that Saied kicked out Al Jazeera, from the country, and part of this broader, competition.
I mean, just to clarify, they weren't kicked out of the country, but their offices were closed and they were essentially expelled from the offices itself. And so they've been working since then, I believe, in the offices of the Journalists Union or some other civil society organization. But yes, this was a move that was in line with this kind of posturing or positioning that it was Ennahda who are and the Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamists who are the boogeyman of Tunisia and the wider region. So this is part of their pushback against them. And it's something which kind of serves Said's policy here, because not only is it useful to pick up that narrative of fighting against Islamism and the Muslim Brotherhood in order to secure support from some very rich friends in the Gulf, but it's also useful for him to keep the support of the street, so that in the coming months, should he start to falter, should he fail at bringing in economic reform or dealing with the pandemic, which is more than likely, he can simply point to a fifth column in the country, say, this is all Ennahda's fault. They're pushing back against me. They are undermining me. And it's something that I think will have some resonance given, how much preparation there has been and, the strength of the narratives produced over the last 10 years that seeks to blame the Muslim Brotherhood for every single ill in the Middle East and North Africa.
So lastly, you mentioned this kind of 30-day inflection point following the events of July 25th. What is that inflection point and what is its significance for how events will unfold in the coming several months?
Well, technically under Article 80, after it's been in force for 30 days, either the Speaker of the Parliament or a collection of parliamentarians have the right to question or to call for a review of whether the state of emergency is still valid by the Constitutional Court. Now, given that there's no Constitutional Court, and so this responsibility falls to President Saied, it's not the most foolproof mechanism for getting a fair reading on this. But nevertheless, the 30-day mark has kind of been held up by everybody as almost like the point where we see whether this was just a move by President Saied to try to jumpstart Tunisia's revolution and to kind of push some reform into the system, or if he's really going to go full autocrat here and just kind of cement power in his hands. So, by the 30-day mark, we should see him appoint a new prime minister. I think, and I might be wrong here, but I think that this was one of the points brought up in his phone call with Antony Blinken. And again, at this 30-day mark, if we don't see any progress, I believe that this is the point where we'll start to see some pushback from the political parties who have, not really said much so far. And again, from all these civil society organizations, which are supporting President Saied for now, because they believe that this is a that he has given them a really rare opportunity to actually force some change into the political system. And so they don't want to spoil this opportunity. But, they are already starting to show some signs of concern. And by the 30-day mark, if we haven't seen any idea of where the country is going next, especially considering the huge problems on the horizon, like an upcoming default, then yeah, this is the point where things become clear, essentially.
Well, Tarek, thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful and timely.
Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Tarek. And Tarek wrote a piece in Dawn Media that very helpfully helped me better understand the situation in Tunisia. And I will post a link to that in the show notes of this episode. Thank you. See you next time. Bye.